14 months after her husband vanished without a trace, Madeline inherited a crumbling mountaintop observatory she never knew existed. When she finally looked through its rusted telescope, it wasn't aimed at the stars. It was pointed dead center at a secret that would shatter her reality forever. The day Nathaniel Hayes disappeared, he left his coffee half-finished on the kitchen island and his cell phone plugged into the wall. He walked out of their Upper West Side apartment on a rainy Tuesday morning, presumably heading to his tenure-track job in the astrophysics department at Columbia University. He never arrived. For 14 months, Madeline existed in a suffocating purgatory. The police investigation, led by a cynical detective named Gregory Finch, yielded nothing but dead ends and a trail of financial devastation. Nathaniel, it turned out, had systematically drained their joint savings, maxed out credit cards in her name, and taken out predatory loans. He wasn't just missing, he had financially ruined her before vanishing. The academic community whispered that Nathaniel had suffered a mental breakdown, obsessed with a fringe theory that had made him the laughingstock of his department. Madeline was left to deal with the debt collectors, the pitying stares, and the agonizing lack of closure. Because there was no body, the life insurance company flatly refused to pay out a dime. Then came the phone call from Harrison Cole, an estate lawyer who had represented Nathaniel's late father. Sitting in Cole's mahogany-paneled office in Midtown Manhattan, Madeline stared blindly at the thick manila envelope placed before her. "I'm sorry to drag you in here, Madeline," Harrison said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "but I was going through some dormant files and discovered an asset that Nathaniel purchased in secret, exactly 3 weeks before he went missing." Madeline's chest tightened. An asset? With what money? "He left me with nothing but eviction notices." "He used an offshore shell LLC," Harrison explained softly, sliding a heavy yellowed deed across the desk. "He bought the Pine Ridge Observatory in the Catskill Mountains. It's 80 acres of rugged timberland with a defunct astronomical facility built in the 1960s. It's yours now. The taxes are severely delinquent, but if you sell the land, you might be able to clear the debt he left you." It made absolutely no sense. Nathaniel was a theoretical physicist, a man who worked with quantum mathematics and computer simulations. He hated observational astronomy. He always joked that looking through telescopes was for 19th-century romantics and amateur stargazers. Why would he bankrupt them to buy a rotting dome in the middle of nowhere? 2 days later, Madeline drove her battered Honda up the winding, treacherous switchbacks of Route 28 in upstate New York. The access road to Pine Ridge was choked with overgrown hemlock and invasive thorny vines that scraped aggressively against her car doors. As she crested the summit, the observatory loomed into view against a heavy gray autumn sky. It looked like a decaying concrete mushroom. The aluminum dome was heavily oxidized, streaked with decades of rust and grime, and stuck open at a slight angle, exposing the interior to the elements. Attached to the dome was a small wood-paneled caretaker's cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of accumulated wet pine needles. Madeline cut the engine. The silence of the mountain was absolute, heavy, and deeply unsettling. Armed with a heavy maglite flashlight and a crowbar she had bought at a local hardware store, she approached the heavy steel door of the facility. The padlock had already been snapped. Someone had been here. Pushing the door open, she was hit by the smell of mildew, ozone, and ancient dust. She stepped into the gloom of the main observation floor. Dominating the center of the room was the telescope, a massive 20-foot-long Boller and Chivens refractor, resembling a heavy artillery cannon pointed upward. But as Madeline shined her flashlight around the circular room, her confusion deepened. The place wasn't abandoned. It was a chaotic, lived-in command center. The curved walls were plastered with topographical maps of the surrounding Hudson Valley, not star charts. Red string connected various peaks and valleys in a manic, chaotic web. On a folding table beneath the telescope sat a modern, high-powered short-wave radio, a Geiger counter, and stacks of Meade composition notebooks filled with Nathaniel's frantic, jagged handwriting. Madeline dropped her bag, her hands trembling as she approached the table. She opened the first notebook. It was dated the week he vanished. They think it's a myth. Langdon thinks I've lost my mind. But the geology matches the 1932 ledger. The Valerius Trust didn't lose the gold in the market crash. They buried it. The geometry of the valley is the key. The lens will see what the naked eye cannot. Madeline felt the blood drain from her face. The Valerius Trust. She recognized the name from Nathaniel's late-night historical ramblings. Arthur Valerius had been a corrupt, wildly paranoid industrialist during the Great Depression who reportedly converted his massive fortune into untraceable bearer bonds and gold bullion, convinced the government was going to seize his wealth. The fortune vanished when Valerius died in a mysterious plane crash over these very mountains. Treasure hunters had scoured the Catskills for 80 years. It was a local ghost story. Nathaniel hadn't run away with another woman. He hadn't just had a breakdown. He had spent all their money trying to find a mythical treasure. Madeline spent the next 4 days living in the damp caretaker's cabin, surviving on canned soup and bottled water. She refused to leave. The sheer rage at her husband's selfish deception had crystallized into a cold, hard determination. If he had bankrupted her for a delusion, she was going to tear this place apart, find whatever he was working on, and prove to herself that it was just madness before she sold the land to the highest bidder. She catalogued every notebook, every map, and every coordinate. Nathaniel's writings grew increasingly paranoid in the final days. He repeatedly mentioned that Langdon is having me watched. Dr. Emmett Langdon had been Nathaniel's mentor at Columbia, a polished, wealthy, highly respected figure in the scientific community who had publicly distanced himself from Nathaniel when the breakdown occurred. Why was his name all over these paranoid journals? On the 5th afternoon, as a brutal mountain storm began to brew, the roar of a heavy engine broke the isolation. Madeline watched through the dirty cabin window as a pristine black Range Rover crawled up the muddy access road. Dr. Emmett Langdon stepped out, wearing a tailored Barber jacket and expensive waterproof boots. He looked entirely out of place in the rugged wilderness, his silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the wind. Madeline stepped out onto the porch, her hand instinctively gripping the heavy iron crowbar she kept by the door. "Dr. Langdon, you're a long way from Manhattan." Langdon offered a warm, practiced smile, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Madeline, my dear, I am so relieved to find you safe. When the estate lawyer mentioned you had inherited this awful place, I was deeply concerned. Nathaniel wasn't in his right mind when he bought it." "How did you know I was here?" Madeline asked, her voice flat. "I have friends in county administration. The deed transfer triggered an alert. May I come in out of the wind?" She didn't move from the doorway. "No." "Why are you here, Emmett?" Langdon sighed, dropping the warm facade just a fraction. Madeline, Nate owed some very dangerous, unsavory people a lot of money. The people who funded this little expedition of his. I want to help you. I'm prepared to buy this property from you today, in cash for 3 times its market value. You can walk away, pay off the debts, and start your life over. Leave this ghost town behind. Madeline stared at him. The offer was staggering. It would solve all her problems. But she remembered the journals. Langdon is having me watched. You're a cosmologist, Emmett, she said slowly. Why would you want 80 acres of worthless timberland with a broken, rusted telescope? Langdon's jaw tightened. I am trying to do a favor for the widow of my favorite student. I think you're lying, Madeline said, her grip tightening on the iron bar. I think you know exactly why Nate was up here. You didn't distance yourself because he was crazy. You distanced yourself so no one would connect you to what he found. Langdon's eyes went dead and cold. The charming professor vanished, replaced by something predatory. He took a step toward the porch. You are grieving and confused, Madeline. You have no idea what you're dealing with. This property isn't safe for you. Sell it to me. Get off my land, she commanded, raising the crowbar an inch, before I call the state police. Langdon stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then, without a word, he turned, got back into his Range Rover, and drove away, the tires spinning aggressively in the mud. Madeline retreated into the observatory, locking the heavy steel door behind her, her heart hammering against her ribs. Langdon's desperation confirmed everything. The treasure wasn't a myth, and Langdon wanted it. She ran back to the main observation floor and stared up at the massive telescope. For days, she had ignored it, assuming it was just a relic. But now, she looked closer. She climbed the rusted scaffolding up to the heavy equatorial mount that held the telescope in place. She grabbed the manual adjustment wheels to swing the massive tube, but they wouldn't budge. She shined her flashlight on the gears. They weren't just rusted. They had been deliberately, meticulously welded together. Thick beads of steel locked the ascension and declination gears permanently in place. The telescope couldn't move. It was permanently locked into a single, highly specific line of sight. Madeline scrambled up to the massive objective lens at the top of the tube. It wasn't standard glass. Nathaniel had replaced it with a custom, highly complex polarized filter, layered with what looked like gold leaf and some sort of crystalline mesh. It was designed to block out ambient light and only capture a very specific wavelength. Her heart racing, she climbed down to the eyepiece. She peered through it, but saw only pitch blackness. She ran to the table and grabbed the final notebook, flipping furiously through the pages until she found a crude sketch of the telescope's crosshairs. Beneath it, Nathaniel had written, "The mountain hides the vault in plain sight. It is invisible to the eye, swallowed by the shadows of the ridge. Only when the autumnal sun hits the quartz vein at a 42-degree angle will the light reflect through the polarized lens." September 22nd, 4:18 p.m. The eye will open. Madeline checked her watch, her breath catching in her throat. Today was September 22nd, the autumnal equinox. The time was 4:05 p.m. She had 13 minutes. She rushed back to the scaffolding, positioning herself behind the heavy brass eyepiece. The storm outside was breaking, the heavy grey clouds fracturing to allow brilliant, blinding shafts of late afternoon sunlight to pierce through the open slit in the observatory dome. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of her wristwatch. 4:15 p.m. Still nothing but blackness in the lens. 4:17 p.m. The sun dipped lower, casting long, violent orange shadows across the Catskill Valley outside. 4:18 p.m. Suddenly, the darkness inside the eyepiece fractured. A blinding flash of amber light erupted through the lens. Madeline gasped, squinting against the sudden brightness. As her eye adjusted to the polarized filter, the optical trickery of the valley fell away. The telescope wasn't pointing at the sky. It was aimed downward, directly across the valley, focused on a massive, sheer cliff face of solid limestone 3 miles away. To the naked eye, the cliff was completely flat and unbroken. But through Nathaniel's heavily modified lens, reacting to the exact angle of the equinox sun hitting a hidden vein of quartz, an optical illusion dissolved. The cliff wasn't solid. Magnified in the crosshairs, Madeline saw an immense, perfectly rectangular fissure hidden behind an outcropping of rock. And deep inside that fissure, glowing in the redirected sunlight, was a massive rusted steel vault door built directly into the side of the mountain. Embossed on the heavy steel were the unmistakable faded letters, Valerius. Her husband hadn't been crazy. He had found it. Before she could pull away from the lens, the sharp, unmistakable sound of the observatory's heavy steel door groaning open echoed through the chamber. Madeline froze. She had locked that door from the inside. Footsteps echoed on the concrete floor below. Heavy, deliberate boots. "I told you, Madeline." Dr. Emmett Langdon's voice echoed up into the dome, chilling her to the bone. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Madeline froze on the upper tier of the rusted scaffolding, her knuckles turning a stark, translucent white as she gripped the heavy iron railing. The damp, frigid air inside the decaying observation dome suddenly felt suffocatingly thin, as if the massive storm raging outside had violently sucked all the oxygen from the room. Below her, the heavy, rhythmic thud of Dr. Emmett Langdon's expensive leather boots echoed against the cracked concrete floor. Each footstep sounding like a hammer striking the inside of a tomb. He stepped into the dim pool of ambient light, filtering through the stuck observatory roof, his pristine silver hair now slightly disheveled from the wind, his tailored Barber jacket dripping with cold rain. But it was his right hand that caused the blood to turn to ice in Madeline's veins. He was holding a compact, matte black handgun, the long, cylindrical shape of a suppressor screwed tightly onto the barrel. It was a weapon designed for quiet, unbothered executions, completely incongruous with the polished, academic world of Ivy League cosmology. "I tried to make this incredibly easy for you, Madeline," Langdon said, his voice smooth, echoing with a chilling, detached calm that bounced off the curved aluminum walls. "I offered you a very generous escape route, a chance to walk away from this mountain, pay off the grotesque debts Nathaniel left you, and return to your comfortable, oblivious life in Manhattan. But you share your late husband's fatal, obsessive curiosity. You just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" Madeline's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she forced herself to keep her voice perfectly steady. She slowly backed away from the brass eyepiece of the Bowler and Chivens refractor, her mind racing through the terrifying geometry of her situation. She was 20 feet in the air, trapped on a narrow metal walkway, armed with nothing but a flashlight. "Where is he, Emmett?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the dome. "Where is Nathaniel? What did you do to my husband?" Langdon let out a long, exhausted sigh, raising the barrel of the suppressed pistol just a fraction of an inch. Nathaniel was a brilliant, beautiful mind, but he was entirely crippled by his own naive morality. When he first stumbled upon the Valerius ledger buried in the university archives, he came directly to me. He needed private funding to verify the geological anomalies in the Catskills, and I provided it. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, completely off the books. But when he actually found the coordinates, when he realized that Arthur Valerius's lost bullion was not only real, but staggering in its sheer volume, Nathaniel suffered a sudden, inconvenient crisis of conscience. He wanted to contact the state authorities. He wanted to surrender $1 billion in untraceable Depression-era gold to the federal government just to secure his name in some dusty historical journal. Langdon took a slow, deliberate step toward the base of the scaffolding, his eyes locking onto hers with predatory intensity. I couldn't allow that. I had investors. Powerful, deeply unforgiving people who do not accept academic glory as a return on investment. I followed him up here 14 months ago. I demanded the final coordinates. But Nathaniel had anticipated my arrival. He locked the telescope, hid the map, and refused to speak. So I did what was absolutely necessary to protect my interests. Now climb down, Madeline. Tell me what you just saw through that lens. The confirmation of her husband's death hit Madeline with the physical force of a freight train. But instead of collapsing into despair, a white-hot, blinding rage erupted in her chest. Nathaniel hadn't abandoned her. He hadn't gone mad. He had died trying to protect a historical legacy from a violent, greedy sociopath. "You killed him," Madeline whispered, her hands shaking as she reached behind her, her fingers blindly tracing the heavy, greased mechanisms of the telescope mount. "I eliminated a liability," Langdon corrected coldly, stepping onto the first rung of the metal stairs. "And if you do not tell me exactly where that telescope is pointing, I will eliminate another. Tell me where the vault is." Madeline's fingers brushed against a heavy steel lever coated in decades of thick, hardened industrial grease. It was the manual emergency release for the telescope's massive, 2-ton iron counterweight system, designed to rapidly lower the optical tube during severe seismic events. "You want to know what I saw?" Madeline screamed, her voice cracking with fury and grief. "I saw you burning in hell." With every ounce of adrenaline coursing through her terrified body, Madeline grabbed the rusted lever with both hands and threw her entire body weight backward. For a terrible, suspended second, nothing happened. Then a deafening metallic shriek echoed through the dome as 80-year-old gears violently disengaged. The massive iron counterweight, suspended directly above the staircase, plummeted downward in a terrifying freefall. Langdon looked up, his eyes widening in sudden, absolute terror. But he had no time to react. The 1-ton block of solid iron smashed into the metal staircase mere inches above his head, instantly collapsing the structural supports. The entire lower section of the scaffolding violently tore away from the concrete wall in a shower of sparks and snapping bolts. Langdon was thrown backward with devastating force, his body slamming brutally against the concrete floor, the suppressed pistol skittering away into the darkness. Madeline didn't wait to see if he was dead. She scrambled up the remaining scaffolding to the emergency maintenance hatch located on the side of the aluminum dome. Kicking the rusted latch open, she squeezed through the narrow opening and threw herself out onto the sloped, wet roof of the observatory, just as the storm broke with violent fury. Freezing rain lashed against her face as she slid down the curved metal, dropping the final 10 feet into the thick, thorny underbrush below. She hit the muddy ground, rolling, ignoring the agonizing pain shooting through her left shoulder. She scrambled to her feet and sprinted blindly into the dark, towering pines, the thunder roaring overhead, masking the sounds of her desperate escape. She had the map in her head. She knew exactly where the sun had pointed. She just had to reach the limestone cliff before Langdon found his gun. The 3-mile trek through the treacherous, storm-ravaged Catskill wilderness was a brutal test of human endurance. Madeline pushed through dense thickets of aggressive brambles that shredded her jeans and sliced deep, bleeding scratches into her arms and face. She waded across a swollen, freezing creek that threatened to sweep her away into the darkness, fueled entirely by the raw, consuming fire of vengeance and a desperate need for the truth. She was not the same woman who had driven up the mountain 5 days ago. The grieving, confused widow had died in that observatory. What remained was a fierce, relentless force of nature. It took her 3 agonizing hours to navigate the jagged ravine, guided only by the intermittent flashes of lightning and the dim, dying beam of her heavy flashlight. Finally, she broke through a dense wall of dripping hemlocks and stumbled into a narrow, rocky clearing. Rising hundreds of feet into the violent, stormy sky was the sheer limestone cliff face she had seen through the polarized lens. Up close, the optical illusion was brilliant and flawless. A massive, jagged outcropping of natural rock perfectly concealed a deep, artificial fissure cut directly into the side of the mountain. Madeline squeezed her exhausted, shivering body through the narrow gap, stepping out of the punishing rain and into the dry, stale air of a massive cavern. Her flashlight beam cut through the absolute darkness, illuminating the terrifying scale of Arthur Valerius's paranoia. Embedded directly into the solid bedrock of the mountain was a colossal, circular steel vault door, measuring at least 10 feet in diameter. It was heavily oxidized but remarkably intact, ringed with heavy steel locking bolts and dominated by a large mechanical rotary dial. Embossed across the center were the letters she had seen from the mountaintop. Valerius. Madeline approached the door, her breath rising in ragged white plumes in the freezing subterranean air. How was she supposed to open it? Langdon had assumed Nathaniel locked the telescope because he had the combination, but Nathaniel hadn't left a code in his notebooks. He hadn't left a key. She shined her light desperately across the heavy steel surface, searching for a clue. Then she saw it. Beneath the heavy rotary dial, scratched crudely into the rusted steel with a pocket knife, was a mathematical sequence. 31415. Pi. The most fundamental constant of geometry, the mathematical foundation of the universe. It was Nathaniel's favorite number, the concept he had built his entire academic career upon. Her hands violently shaking from the freezing cold and exhaustion, Madeline grasped the heavy brass dial. It was incredibly stiff, resisting her movements with the grinding friction of 80 years of neglect. She put her entire back into it, forcing the dial to spin. 3 right, 1 left, 4 right, 1 left, 5 right. As she locked the final number into place, a deep, resonant click echoed from deep within the steel door. It sounded like a massive subterranean vault shifting. Madeline grabbed the heavy iron release lever and pulled with all her remaining strength. With a deafening, terrifying groan of metal on metal, the massive steel door slowly swung outward, releasing a blast of stale, incredibly dry air that smelled of old paper, dust, and something deeply organic. Madeline stepped over the heavy steel threshold, shining her flashlight into the cavernous interior of the Valerius vault. The beam illuminated row after row of heavy wooden crates, stacked 10 feet high and stretching far into the darkness. She stepped closer to the nearest crate, prying the rotting wooden lid back with her bare, bleeding hands. Inside, wrapped in degrading canvas, were rows of heavy, dull yellow bars. Solid gold bullion. There were thousands of them. The sheer, staggering volume of wealth sitting in the darkness was utterly incomprehensible. It was a fortune large enough to topple small nations, sitting exactly where Arthur Valerius had buried it during the height of the Great Depression. But Madeline didn't care about the gold. Her flashlight beam swept past the crates, hitting the far wall of the vault. Her breath hitched in her throat, and a shattered, agonizing sob ripped violently from her chest. Sitting against the far wall, illuminated in the pale beam of her light, was the skeletal remains of a man wearing a familiar, heavy winter coat. "Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice breaking into 1,000 pieces. She collapsed to her knees beside his body. Langdon hadn't murdered Nathaniel in the woods. He had chased him here. Nathaniel must have opened the vault, realized Langdon would kill him the moment he laid eyes on the gold, and made a devastating, sacrificial choice. Nathaniel had forced himself inside the vault and manually thrown the heavy interior locking bolts, sealing himself inside with the treasure to ensure Langdon could never, ever reach it. He had chosen to slowly suffocate in the darkness rather than let a murderer claim the Valerius fortune. Clutched in Nathaniel's skeletal fingers was a small, black digital voice recorder and a heavily folded piece of paper. Madeline reached out with trembling hands, gently taking the items from her husband's final grasp. She unfolded the paper. It was a legally binding holographic will, transferring total ownership of the offshore LLC, the Pine Ridge Land, and everything hidden beneath it directly to Madeline. She pressed the play button on the recorder. Nathaniel's voice, weak, raspy, and struggling for oxygen, echoed in the silent golden tomb. "Madeline, if you are hearing this, it means you found the lens. It means you figured it out. I'm so incredibly sorry for the pain I have caused you. Emmett Langdon is outside the door. He is a murderer, and he is tied to a violent criminal syndicate. I have locked the vault from the inside. He will never get this gold. Take this recording to Detective Finch." Langdon confessed everything to me on tape before I ran. "The gold is yours, Maddie. Use it to destroy him. I have loved you every second of my life." Tears streamed hot and fast down Madeline's dirt-streaked face. Her husband hadn't abandoned her. He had died a hero, leaving her the ultimate weapon to exact devastating justice. She carefully tucked the recorder and the will into her pocket, kissing her fingers and pressing them gently to Nathaniel's skull. She stood up, turning her back on billions of dollars in gold, and walked out of the vault, locking the heavy steel door behind her. 6 hours later, as the dawn broke over the Catskills in a wash of bruised purple and brilliant orange, Detective Gregory Finch led a heavily armed tactical unit into the Pine Ridge Observatory. They found Dr. Emmett Langdon exactly where Madeline had left him, trapped beneath the collapsed steel scaffolding, his shoulder shattered, shivering in the freezing rain. When Finch played Nathaniel's deathbed recording over a portable speaker, Langdon's arrogant, sophisticated facade crumbled into pathetic, weeping terror. Madeline stood at the edge of the property line, watching the police drag Langdon away in heavy iron handcuffs. The nightmare was finally over. She had walked onto this mountain as a broken, heavily indebted widow. She was leaving as the sole, legal heir to the largest undiscovered fortune in modern American history, having entirely cleared the name of the man she loved. If Madeline's incredible journey of survival, betrayal, and uncovering the truth captivated you, don't keep this thrilling mystery to yourself. Hit that like button to support true stories of resilience. Share this video with your friends who love mind-bending historical mysteries, and absolutely smash that subscribe button for more jaw-dropping, real-life dramas delivered right to your screen every single week. What would you have done with the Valerius gold? Tell us in the comments below.